Hi, I'm Chris DiBona. I work for Google. It's a company. And I look after open source software for the company as much as anyone does. I like to say that I'm responsible for a lot of stuff around open source, as much as, so you can blame me if there's something wrong, is the long and short of it. But I'm not the only person who works in open source by any measure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and to give you a picture of what a day in their life is like working on these projects. And maybe each of you can say, you know, what's the favorite thing you see in a contributor, a new contributor to a project, right? So Cassandra, introduce yourself.
Oh, OK.
Yeah.
My name is Cassandra Salisbury. I am on the open source strategy team and a program manager for developer relations for Golang. A day in my life.
Yeah.
It's a lot of emails, but they're primarily around strategy for growing Golang and how to work open source at Google, as well as how to support our 1.6 million users for Go. My favorite thing about
How many million?
1.6 million. Yeah, it's up a lot in the last year.
Did you personally count them?
I mean, I asked for the gophers and, you know, by color and demographic, and I feel like it's close. Okay. Yeah, I feel like it's close. Maybe we'll get more exact this year. But yeah, I think my favorite thing about a new contributor, is that what you asked? Is just passion and excitement and willing to jump in and solve a problem when they see one.
So your favorite kind of new contributor is when he just dives in?
Yeah, it's the most helpful, I think, for me.
So if I were to put my finger out and point at somebody and say, you're going to commit to Go, you're going to have them go to the bug list? Or I'm
going to have them go to GitHub, or I'm going to have them join Go for Slack, because it's a really active group. If they are already into Go and programming in Go, then they can go help the newbies out. And if they haven't, then they can get a lot of their questions answered there and figure out where the best place to start is.
And the Go for Slack, and I'm sorry, I'm going to betray my age. In the old days, on the pound Perl on IRC, if somebody were to ask a question, often a certain person would say, I'm not here to do your homework, or it wasn't me. Or that sounds like web programming. You want a different channel. And it was very unfriendly. Is the Slack channel friendlier?
One of the things I love about the Go community is we have a pretty stringent code of conduct. Okay. And the Go for Slack is very heavily regulated for welcomeness and inclusivity. That's
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because pound Perl drove tons of people into Python's loving arms. Yeah. Which was fine. Python's a fine language, right? So, yeah. Will.
Yes.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Will Norris. I work for Chris. So I work in our open source programs office. I manage two teams that are primarily focused on open source compliance. So we are ultimately responsible for reviewing all open source code that comes into Google and all open source code that leaves Google. Which turns out to be a lot. So we review every package as it comes in.
By hand, line by line.
Yeah, line by line. We review each one. No. So our engineering team, the only way that we're able to handle this is by automating as much of this as possible. So we have a lot of tooling around automatically scanning for licenses and enforcing various policies. We manage, I don't know, we're at 140 or so organizations on GitHub. Which is a lot to manage. So we've got a lot of tooling that uses their API to manage that, and that kind of stuff. And then I also work in a lesser capacity with our outreach team, which is responsible for our own programs for doing outreach. Google Summer of Code and Google Code-In are both kind of focused at students and getting them involved in open source. We do that a lot. And then we do a lot of sponsorship and donations and memberships and things like that.
And what is the to-do group?
The to-do group it's a group within the Linux Foundation that is basically the open source offices at a lot of different companies. So it's it's kind of like me or Chris at Facebook and Microsoft and most of the big companies that you would think about. We get together about quarterly and share a lot of best practices, some tooling, because it turns out we're all solving exactly the same problems in slightly different ways. And so it's trying to get more dialogue between companies that are really trying to do open source well and getting those companies talking.
And like we asked Cassandra, when you see a newcomer coming in, are there any like specific traits that you say, oh, that's going to be a successful developer? I know it, or they're going to be a disaster? I don't know. I'm not going to be a negative, but yeah.
I think someone who's...
So Will has to handle the bulk of the incoming new people and making sure that they're properly,
Yeah. I think someone who is willing to take the time to learn the community that they're getting involved with. We actually just hired a few engineers on my team, and we use Go for all of our tooling. And someone made a comment about tabs versus spaces. And I was like, yeah, you just have to understand, with Go, you use Go fumped, and you're done, and you don't think about it. And just how refreshing it is to just accept the community that you're moving into and not try to fight it. That tends to work out really well. We see the same thing with like CLAs, our legal agreements that we have to have for a variety of reasons. But I would actually answer your question a little bit differently, which is the thing that I love to see most in newcomers is when they land that first patch to a project, and just kind of the sense of completion and joy that comes from that. I know the Go team did a special hackathon about a year ago where they were really focusing on getting people contributing to Go core. And it was an amazing event where they've got, I don't know how many dozens of new contributors to the core project, and it worked out really great.
Thank you, Will. Sarah?
I'm Sarah Novotny, and I lead the open source strategy group for Google Cloud Platform. And my first project here at Google was to embed, much like Will described, learning the Kubernetes community and engaging with that community to help it evolve from being a company-led project to a community-led project. Since then, we have grown the team and the number of projects that we are embedding people in to 8, including Go, which Cassandra is embedded in. And we choose these projects as projects that are either strategically important for Google to open source, so a first-party or outbound project, and some open source projects that are strategically important to our customers on Google Cloud Platform. So things like Node.js, since JavaScript is now more common in production than Java, we needed to be involved in that language and JavaScript standards and work like that. So I also lead the relationship with the Linux Foundation. Will mentioned the to-do group as part of that. I sit on the Node.js Foundation board, helped found and move Kubernetes to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, and helped the Open Container Initiative build its first specifications for container portability. But you want to know what I want to see in a contributor.
A new contributor.
A new contributor. I
Shiny,
think brand new. I think there are a couple of things in someone coming into a community, any community, whether it's your local nonprofit Boys and Girls Club or an open source community. It's understanding the norms of that community and not trying to change it too quickly. You have to start by learning the story of how that community has gotten to where it is before you say you're doing it wrong. And you spoke about the people who come into a community and you're like, ooh, that's not going to work. It's those that come in and say, you need to change this. You need to do it this way. You have to earn your credibility and earn your opportunity to make those sorts of changes in a community. You really need to start with helping the community with the things they need before you tell them the things you think they should do.
So I want to make sure that I clarify so when I find someone who I go, oh gosh, they're coming on strong, or oh gosh, I'm not sure this is going to work out, those are the ones that I try to like, grab and like a mother kitten and bring them into the project and say, hey, here's something you should check out, and this it's right in line with what you seem to be good at, and I try to make them into the thing that is best for the project.
It also speaks to Cassandra's point about being excited about and engaged in, because sometimes people come into these communities saying, oh, you really need to fix this, and that's their excitement showing. So if you can redirect that excitement, it's sort of like open source jujitsu. Move that weight and say, here are 3 things we need done. Let's start with these, and you can actually encourage them. We've, in the Kubernetes community, Paris Pittman has spent a lot of time working on multiple types of mentoring in order to help the new contributor onboarding experience and bring people in as graciously as possible and get them working on things that the project needs that also gets them the quick win to the first patch. And then from there, grow their influence in the project.
So one thing I want to ask all 3 of you is, so we've been talking about these big projects, your TensorFlows, your Kubernetes. I was thinking about TensorFlow. We didn't talk about it yet, but and all the rest. But one of the things that people come and ask me about all the time, and I know that you've been asked this, is getting to that first new contributor, going from this, oh, well, here's a cool thing we're going to release, to, and then skipping right to, it's like, step 1, underpants, step 3, profit. It's like, we all talk about these communities and building these huge ecosystems, but a lot of projects, they never get to that first external contributor. So what would you do to help a project get there, or what have you done to help a project get there? Maybe it's in a sub-library of Go, or I'm very curious. Because I honestly, I have a hardest time with this question.
So I'll jump in, because in my team, we have a number of people that are working across a number of projects, and some of them are at very early stages. There are projects that have been recently released. There are projects that have been out for 8 years. And so there's this whole gamut within the life cycle. The new projects, one of the best ways to get new people involved and get people excited is to be an advocate in that project. And so that means that it is easier and more successful if someone who is already participating in the project is super excited about it and starts drawing in their friends, starts drawing in the people that they know, starts talking about it on Twitter, starts just sharing that excitement. And those projects start to take off and start to build just a reinforcement of that advocacy if you can share your excitement. If you're doing this because it's horrible and it just needs to be fixed and then I'm going to open source it, it's not likely to take off as a broader project. But if you can say why this is super neat and why you are so excited about fixing it, or making this available to the broader community, or how it fits in another community and bootstrap off of that, then you find like-minded people. They may be your friends, they may be other people trying to solve the same sort of problem, and you can invigorate their interest. But it does take some evangelism.
I would say one of the key things you can do is to make sure that your project is ready and welcoming to newcomers. And so this comes down a lot of times to the way that you manage your community and just the documentation. We find that from projects that had participated in the Summer of Code in previous years, even if the work that the students did on that project, I mean, maybe it was great, maybe it wasn't, but invariably, those projects end up having to focus so much on their getting started documentation, of making sure that they have a clear guide for people to get up and running in a very short amount of time. And those kinds of changes really stick with the project and just make the project welcoming in general. One of the things we encourage a lot, and this is pretty common, is having a set of issues on your project that are specifically labeled for beginners. Like beginner tasks that the core team doesn't work on, and they intentionally don't work on it so that when that newcomer comes, there's a really kind of bite-size issue that they can fix. And that really easy, setting them up for success, I think is really kind of where I would say.
To that point, you can use those new contributors to help with that onboarding process, because they get stuck. You say, that's great, let's document this. And then you work with them to improve that process.
One of the most valuable perspectives, I think, is the person who doesn't know.
Yeah.
And it's so valuable because you lose that perspective so quickly. And we find this internally at Google, is because Google is structured so that you can move around between teams very easily. And so there's a lot of mobility. And when that new person comes to your team, like, you have to take advantage of that time. It's like you've got a very short window before they start learning all that institutional knowledge that never gets written down. And so you've got to write it down, when that person is first coming on.
Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, I totally want to just point out the cross-promotion with other communities,
Yes.
right? Because we've seen that on a massive scale with Go, in Kubernetes, in Docker. I used to run a meetup in San Francisco for Go, and the amount of evangelists kind of naturally coming to that and doing speaking engagements really perpetuates that level of like, ooh, this sounds really awesome. So 5 years ago, I'm looking at, oh, I heard that one meetup, that one time, that one talk, and it's exploded just because people are willing to talk about it. I also think, off of Will's point, in a smaller project that I worked on prior to Google, labeling in GitHub was a huge help for new contributors. And then after, since we've talked about kind of the getting of the contributors, after you have a nice little small pool, we would do weekly meetings with them for like 30 minutes just to encourage them and to make them feel like they were really part of a collaborative process.
Which ends up leading to making the feeling of a tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Exactly.
need to have some sort of cohesive group feeling in order to join and participate, and you have to feel as if you're making some sort of contribution that is recognized and valued. And every community needs to have that space where you are able to say, I participated, I met the luminary who wrote Go, the luminary who started Kubernetes. And then there's this sense of togetherness. You end up aligning a group of people in a single direction, and you can't understate how valuable, or you can't overstate how valuable that is.
So before I ask my next broad question type thing, we do have some microphones, and in about 10 minutes, if you want to ask, we'll see. There's there and there. So we say this word community a lot, and it's kind of, in some ways, the least defined thing ever. And we say open a lot. And I'm not going to say it's frustrating for me, but I've always tried to be really annoyingly particular about this. And so when you say community, when you say open, and I think open source software licensed under an open source license and offered to the public, but what does it mean to you? What is your gold standard of how you would like to best interact technically in these projects? So I just, and I know this is part me projecting, but
If I'm looking at what does it take to be open, then I'm looking at transparency, Do we know why decisions are being made in a project? Can we see clear paths? Is documentation transparent, easy to follow? I'm looking at collaboration. So how easy is it to contribute to the process? Does it feel collaborative? Are people interacting? Are they meeting at conferences? Are they interacting on a Slack or a channel? And then I think lastly, it would be inclusivity, making sure that there's an openness of all types of opinions and needs, and that they're being listened to, and that people feel it's easy to, again, just have access and feel included in the process.
I think there's another underpinning component to all of those, which is respect for all the people participating. And it goes back to Will's point that newcomer's view, even if you don't see it and it seems perfectly obvious how you should get from A to C, that newcomer's view is gold. Because there is friction there. And that friction, if it's not going to be a contributor who drops out, it might be a user who drops out. And so you're decreasing your adoption. So you have this adoption curve or this contributor curve where it's like everybody who thinks that Kubernetes might be awesome, and then everybody who has read Contributing MD and maybe got stymied by it, and then suddenly you've got a list of people who did understand what we were saying because we actually forgot to mention that K8S means Kubernetes. And then you've got this group who's bothered to stick around long enough to actually go through all these hurdles. And so you've decreased the number of people and the people that you're engaging with a lot if you're not respecting that newcomer view, if you're not respecting the challenges and feedback that people are bringing to you. So that, to me, is one of the core pieces of openness.
Will?
Licenses. Sorry.
Licenses. No, I would say maybe provide a slightly different perspective, which is we've often said at Google that there's no one way to do open source.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that. And that's true in so many different ways, in terms of licenses, in terms of governance models, in terms of community management styles. And Google is big enough that, Sarah was making this point earlier, that even within the 8 or so projects that they engage with, there's a lot of variety. Within the thousands of projects that Google releases, there is a huge amount of variety. And it really comes back to why did you open source it to begin with? And it's going to be different for every project. And so that gold standard really depends on what were the goals of releasing that project in the first place. And that's going to guide how you make a lot of decisions. And that's something that Sarah and I have been working on together for a little while, is helping provide that guidance for teams at Google to really think through why are they releasing it as open source, and then let that kind of dictate how they answer a lot of these other questions.
You also have the spectrum between open source software to an open source project to an open and inclusive community, which is even further.
Right.
So open source software I often define as code that is publicly available and has a license that the OSI has checkbox said this is an open source license. So that would be open source software. It doesn't mean you get an opinion on it. It doesn't mean you get to contribute or change it. But it's open, it's available, you're free to use it, you're free to look at it, you're free to fork it, you're free to change it on your own, but you may not be able to modify the core software as it stands. But as you move down the progression and the continuum toward project, it becomes much more about pulling together a cohesive community that is looking to solve a larger problem than any one perspective can accurately scope. Sort of the blind men trying to describe an elephant. Each different piece of your community comes to the project bringing you a different perspective. And this is one of the things we saw in Kubernetes. Google had a very opinionated way of dealing with containers. We built Borg, we built Omega. We knew Kubernetes was going to be a thing that the world needed. but we needed more perspectives. And so that had to be an open community. That is not every project. And that is not every project that is released by anyone. It's not every project released by Google. Android, as an example, has fewer people contributing and changing the way the Android open source project moves from outside of Google than Kubernetes at this, well, maybe not direct numbers because of the years, but there are different amounts of influence based on the strategic goals of the project.
So I don't want to turn this into my personal meeting with my colleagues, but what's wrong with how we release code from Google? What would you want to see different? What's hard? What sort of problems have you seen when releasing code from the company? Because I have people from other big companies come to me all the time and say, wow, you released a lot of stuff, but you didn't release this one thing I wanted you to release. And I'm like, So tell me how we could be doing a better job and how we could all be doing a better job.
I know the answer to that one immediately. And it really relates to what we were just talking about, that there is no one way to do open source. We could absolutely do a better job of setting expectations. That when you find a random project in one of our GitHub orgs or on googlesource.com or wherever you find a project, is this a project that is being used in production at Google? Is this being actively developed? Is it looking for community, or is this just a project that is intended to be consumed but maybe not collaborated on? And we can, you can argue on which one is better and all of that, but regardless of any of that, just setting the right expectation is something that we could absolutely do a better job of.
Yeah. For the Go project, we do have a really collaborative, we want contributors, et cetera. And so some of the things that we've learned would be ask for opinions and contributions early on. So if you are going to release, then sometimes you get feedback from behind the doors, so that when you do, you get a little bit less of a nudge there. But I think even more so, it is that you need to, exactly what you're saying, Will, it's an iterative process. Usually, when you have a collaborative project, it's all iterative. And so that's the one thing we've learned is be clear. Yes, it may not be perfect when it is first released, but it's all iterative. And the reason we do that is because we want those contributions.
And just being honest and transparent about where a project is along that spectrum.
Yeah.
I'm willing to go out on a limb and say I guarantee it won't be perfect when it goes out
No, for
first.
sure won't. Yeah, no, for sure.
But to Will's point, making sure that we are setting expectations is important, but also showing growth paths, showing how someone can contribute and how they can continue to engage with the project, showing where the project's needs are, and making sure that when we are engaging with the community, that their feedback is recognized, even if it isn't followed.
Mm-hmm.
So should I ask about contributor license agreements and DCOs? I mean, how much actual problems do you see around the apparatus of intellectual property actually keeping you from getting contributors and all the rest? Because this is something we talk about quite a bit. I mean, we're a big company, okay? So we care a lot about where software comes from, who's writing it, who owns that intellectual property as it's released. And we have to be very, very careful about it because we get sued a lot. Yeah. So I'd be really interested in hearing if you've seen a real problem because of that, or I mean, because
You see it occasionally. For the most part, the biggest problems we see are just weird edge cases that our automated tooling can't handle. And so a fair amount of my time and my team's time is spent dealing with those edge cases and walking people through the process and figuring it all out. We will occasionally see someone who just is adamant about not wanting to sign a contributor license agreement. And in those cases, we have to say, I'm sorry, this is just something that we do require for a variety of reasons. And we've seen time and time again where having that contributor license agreement has saved us or has allowed us a degree of flexibility. For example, we relicensed Angular a few years ago. We originally released it under the Apache 2 license. The community, the JavaScript community largely preferred MIT. And so we talked about it, and we made the decision to relicense the project under MIT at the community's request. This was something that was only possible because we had contributor license agreements for all of those contributors.
Yep.
And
I'll play devil's advocate, because Kubernetes was a challenge for this.
Yep.
So Kubernetes went out into the world with a half-dozen corporate entities really working closely with Google. So our 1.0 launch had all of these corporate collaborators. And that worked great, because we all understood how this worked. We were all signing the Google contributor license agreement. It was all OK. But the idea that Kubernetes was to be industry changing and actually move the way we thought about portable workloads in the cloud meant that we needed more and more and more companies, especially very large companies, especially companies who may or may not compete with Google in different consumer areas and business product areas, means that it got to be a lot more contentious. So I want to contribute to your thing. I want to help you achieve your goals, but I can't sign your license. And so we got stuck with a few corporate contributors saying, that's great, but we can't. And Kubernetes, because we knew we wanted this, again, going back to what was the strategic goal, going back to what the strategic goal was, we wanted this to change the industry. And so we knew that to do that, we had to let go of some of the control. And that was the creation of the Cloud Native Compute Foundation at the Linux Foundation. And that then allowed us to take the same language we use for the Google Contributor License Agreement, cross out Google, say Cloud Native Compute Foundation in all the locations, change the tooling so that it was the Cloud Native Compute Foundation license, transfer all the licenses with all the existing contributors, and now those companies that were not happy about signing a Google contributor license agreement were perfectly content to sign the same language as long as that transfer of IP went to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. And that was a fine solution for this. A lot of younger projects, more recent projects, have focused on DCOs and not CLAs, developer certificates of origin, instead of contributor license agreements or corporate contributor license agreements. And that's not something that Google is comfortable with, because there's not a lot of case law about it at this point. And a lot of the case law is being litigated right now. And until there is a clear path, until there is a clear way that you can handle the oops, we need to relicense this, or oops, we need to make a big change without having to contact the thousands of contributors that may have contributed to a project. Until that case law exists, it's too big of a risk.
Have you seen any problems with this?
Well, Go sits a little differently in the bucket than I think everyone else's projects do. Yeah. Being that we're a programming language, it is a little bit different. But I can say that last summer, before I joined Google, I sat in a room, Will, you alluded to this, with I think it was 150 for our first ever contributor workshop. And it did require that everyone go through the CLA process, which was interesting together. But it was also super rad. And I definitely didn't have any problems at my table. And I don't believe we had any problems with that particular portion of it at the other tables. So,
well, thank you for that.
Inside baseball.
What's that?
It's totally inside baseball.
It is, but I'm the moderator, so whatever. No, I mean that in a nice way. And we're out of time, so I'm gonna say thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to the panelists, and have a great rest of your I/O.